will be good throughout. All right, so I do, like Bree said, there's a lot of material that I'm hoping to cover. I'm gonna try not to go too in depth on each slide because I'd like to get through everything and in my allotted time, and make sure you have time to hear from Netta as well, equal time to hear from Netta as well. So my name is Amanda Glass. I am an attorney at the Arizona Center for Disability Law, and I will be speaking with you all today about the legal rights of students with disabilities when it comes to education, and talking about some of the nuances around your rights as foster parents. What are you entitled to legally? What aren't you entitled to? What steps can you take if you encounter a dispute with the school? Things like that. And I do want to try to make this as relevant as possible and interactive. So if any of you have a question, I can see the classroom on my screen. So if you want to just like pop a hand up or call out, please do. Please don't worry about interrupting me because I'd like to answer your questions and make this relevant to you all. All right. So let me give you a quick background. So like I said, I'm from the Arizona Center for Disability Law. We are Arizona's nonprofit protection and advocacy agency. There is a protection and advocacy agency in every state and territory in the United States. So there's a sister organization like ours, no matter where you are in the US. We are charged by US Congress to provide advocacy, information, referral services, community legal education, and in some cases, legal representation to individuals with disabilities. And we work in a variety of areas. We provide representation for people when it comes to discrimination in housing, in employment, in healthcare services, but we do quite a bit of work in the area of education as well, special education specifically. And that's sort of the practice that I'm in charge of at our office. So quick disclaimer, the purpose of the training is just to provide you all with some general information. It's in summary form. It is not legal advice. I am not your attorney. I am not your child's attorney. And also everything I'm going over today could change at any time depending on legislation. So, stay on top of new laws as they pass. All right, so to start out, why is special education important for foster youth? About twice as many foster youth are eligible for special education as those students in the general population. About 40% of Arizona foster youth will change schools at least once during the school year, compared with only 10% of other students. The dropout rate for foster youth is triple the dropout rate for students statewide. And our kids in foster care also tend to experience worse long-term outcomes as well. So many are likely to experience time homeless, many experience incarceration, and even more face unemployment. But a lot of these negative outcomes can be prevented or ameliorated by the implementation of appropriate and timely support services. So if a kiddo is in need of special education or related services, the sooner we can get those in place and get them protected legally, the better. The more likely they are to have improved long-term outcomes. Unfortunately, the special education system is very dependent on parental involvement. And obviously, if a kiddo's in foster care, they don't have a consistent parent or adult in their life. So that makes things difficult. It makes it hard to know who's the parent, who has legal authority. It makes it hard to have consistency when it comes to communications with the school. So that's I know you all have done a lot to help kiddos in your care. And I'm hoping today some of the information I share will help you to continue to advocate for the kids you're working with and to be that parent who can fight for what they need. So starting right at the beginning, what is special education really? It is the practice of educating students in a way that addresses their individual differences and needs. It's not a place. So some schools will say, oh, special ed, our special ed program is full, or our special ed program is down the hall. It's not a place, it's not its own program. It's really this practice of tailoring educational services to meet the individualized needs of a student with a disability. And it can be delivered in a variety of settings. It's not necessarily a separate classroom or a separate school. Many kids who qualify for special education spend most of their time in a regular classroom setting. They're just getting additional services either in that classroom setting, or they might be pulled out for some one-on-one time. They are working on specific goals that are tailored to their needs, and they're working with certain accommodations sometimes or modifications to curriculum, but it's not necessarily a totally different program or a different place that they have to go to. It's really just the blanket term for meeting disability-related needs for our students. So where does special ed come from a legal perspective? So there are two federal laws that govern special education. The first is called the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or IDEA. So if you're working with a kiddo who has an IEP, which stands for Individualized Education Program, this is the law where that comes from. They qualify under IDEA and they are protected and covered under IDEA. The other federal law is called Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, and you may have worked with kiddos who have 504 plans. That's a reference to this law. But what I want you to notice in the Venn diagram to the left is that IDEA and 504 students are that small middle circle. So if a kiddo qualifies under IDEA, they're actually also covered by Section 504. They automatically qualify for both. Now, you're not going to have a kiddo who has an IEP and a 504 plan, because that's redundant. If they qualify for an IEP, everybody knows they're covered by 504. They don't need a separate plan for that. The IEP does a better job anyway, so that covers them all around. But the reason to know that is because 504 is a non-discrimination law that protects students from being discriminated against on the basis of disability. So if a kiddo has an IEP, they are entitled to all the services and protections of IDEA. They are also entitled to be free from discrimination under Section 504. And that's relevant when we get to complaint options, because you could file a complaint for a kiddo who has an IEP under IDEA, but you could also file a complaint under Section 504 because they're covered by both. So that was the reason that's relevant. But as you can see, that is the smallest circle, which is because IDEA has the most stringent or strict eligibility criteria. It's hardest to be found eligible under IDEA. The 504 circle there is a little bigger because more kids can be found eligible under 504. And then, of course, the rest of the student population is the biggest circle. So I am going to go over the difference between IDEA and 504 a little bit more, how you're found eligible for one versus the other, but that's sort of something to keep in the back of your head, is that if you have an IEP, yes, you're covered by IDEA, but you're also covered by 504. All right, so what is the difference between an IEP and a 504 plan? So students who qualify under IDEA will get an IEP. All students with disabilities are protected by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Whether or not they meet the strict criteria for an IEP, they are definitely covered by 504. And like I said, 504 is a broad civil rights law. It protects students from disability-based discrimination. So sometimes we'll see students who are tested to see if they qualify for an IEP under IDEA. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Often what we'll see is a kiddo doesn't qualify under IDEA. They're not going to get an IEP. But we do know that they need some accommodations, or they may even need some related services like speech therapy or occupational therapy. In that case, that student may be provided a 504 plan. We know that they qualify under 504. We know that they need some extra supports at school. So we're going to give them a 504 plan that lays out those supports. But not every kid with a disability who qualifies under Section 504 even gets a 504 plan. You are protected from discrimination, whether you have a 504 plan or not, if you have a disability. The point of the 504 plan is to A, kind of memorialize that we know you have a disability, but B, to lay out any accommodations or related services you may need at school. So even kiddos, like if you have a kiddo who maybe, let's say, has autism, but is super high functioning, like super, super high functioning, really doesn't need much help at school. They don't need any services. They really don't even need accommodations or modifications in any way. They may not need a 504 plan, but if they go to school and they're getting bullied because of their autism, or a teacher's treating them differently because of their autism, even though they don't have a 504 plan, they may have a claim under Section 504 for disability-based harassment or disability-based discrimination that they could bring to an enforcement agency. Whether they have a 504 plan or not, they're still covered because they have that diagnosis. All right, so big differences again between IEPs and 504s. Like I said, IEPs are harder to get. It's harder to be found eligible. That's why on that diagram, that circle was the smallest circle. The 504 circle was a little bigger because it's easier to be found eligible under 504. What about services? So students with IEPs may be provided special education related services and accommodations. Students with 504 plans are typically only provided accommodations and sometimes related services, but they are not going to get special education. And I'll kind of go over what special education is in a future slide. But essentially, yes, was there a question?
No, just my computer. Go ahead.
Oh, okay, sorry. All right. Okay, and then specificity. So IEPs are often, they're way more specific than a 504 plan. I've seen IEPs, I would say most IEPs are like, the simplest IEP I've ever seen is probably 5 pages long, but they can be, 12, 20, 25 pages long with lots of detail. 504 plans are usually like 1 or 2 pages. They're much simpler. There's a lot less detail. And that's because IDEA has a lot of rules about what has to go into an IEP. 504 doesn't actually even mention a written document, which is why it's okay for kids to go to school and qualify under 504, but not have a written plan. A lot of schools will create written plans because that's helpful to have something documented, but there's no regulation around what goes into a 504 plan really, other than the policies the school develops around that. So you're going to have a lot more specifics in an IEP than you would in a 504 plan. And then in terms of rights, students who qualify under IDEA and Section 504 both have the right to a free, appropriate public education. However, students who are eligible for IEPs have more procedural safeguards. They do have more rights, especially around discipline, around regularity of meetings, around parent involvement. There's a lot more procedural safeguards, meaning rights, that exist under IDEA than there are under 504. All right, so how are you found eligible? So for an IEP, it's a 2-pronged test, and you have to meet both of these prongs. First, the child has to fit under one of 13 explicit disability categories that are laid out in the federal law. And as a result of that disability, the child needs special education services and related services. So often, especially with autism, what we will see is that kiddo fits the category of autism. So they meet prong 1. We know they have the diagnosis. The school has tested them and see that they fit. Definitely good on prong 1. The problem is prong 2. Does the kiddo's autism cause them to need special education and related services? And obviously that seems like a super subjective and vague standard, but that's the legal standard. It's very wishy-washy, and you can argue it either way. Often parents will argue, of course they need these services, and schools will say, no, they don't. They're getting by. They're doing okay. We don't think they need specially designed instruction or related services. So that's sometimes where the disagreement comes in. Sometimes it is prong 1. It's that the parent says they have autism. I have a medical diagnosis. And the school says, well, we don't see it that way. We're going to either not qualify them at all, or we're going to qualify them under a different category like other health impairment or emotional disability. So sometimes we see the fight at the first part of the test. Sometimes we see it at the second part. Sometimes it's the whole thing. The school doesn't think they fit and doesn't think they need special ed. The parent thinks they need both. So it depends, but it is important to remember that they have to fit both. They have the disability, and the disability causes them to need special education and related services. So here are the categories. Autism is here, but there are 13 total. Some of them are really specific, like traumatic brain injury has a very specific definition. Some of them are not. Other health impairment is a very broad category, and a lot of things fall under that. ADHD is under this, but so is epilepsy and diabetes. So this one's kind of the catch-all, other health impairment, but the others are fairly specific, and you can find definitions for all of these in the federal law as well as in Arizona law. On the other hand, Section 504, as I've said, much easier to be found eligible. The student must be determined to either have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or have a record of such an impairment, or be regarded as having such an impairment. So they don't actually even need to currently be impaired. They don't need to have a disability today to qualify. It could be that they used to have one, or people treat them like they have one. And then the other piece is that major life activities, it's not just learning or going to school. It's all kinds of things like caring for yourself, performing manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, breathing, learning, and working. So this is clearly a much broader definition. It captures a lot more of our students than the IDEA eligibility criteria would capture. All right, so process-wise, what's the difference between an IEP and a 504? So they start out kind of the same. Both of them will start here with the referral. And sometimes, like I said, parents will refer, a parent will say, I think the kiddo needs an IEP. So they'll refer for an IEP, but throughout this cycle, eventually they end up at, are they eligible? Well, I guess here, are they eligible? Determination of eligibility. If they're found to not be eligible in the IEP process, that is sometimes where the school steps in and says, well, they're not eligible for an IEP, but we're willing to do a 504 plan. And then you kind of hop over to this one and you're like, oh, okay, well, we'll create a 504 plan. But sometimes parents don't want an IEP for the kiddo, or it's a school-based referral. The school can also make a referral. We just typically see parents being the ones to do it. So you could know, I don't think my kid needs special education, but I do know they are going to need some accommodations because of their disability. So I'm actually not even going to ask for an IEP and go through this whole thing. I'm just going to ask for a 504. Now, either way, there is an evaluation process. There is a determination of eligibility. A plan is usually created, and then there is some type of reevaluation. But you can see the IEP process is a little more in depth. So I'm going to go through the IEP one. The parent, let's say, wants an IEP, so they submit a request in writing. My suggestion is to always put it in writing, whether it's an email or a letter. If you're going to do a letter, make sure you send it either return receipt requested to prove it was received, or take it down in person and have the front office staff stamp with a date and time stamp of when you dropped it off to prove that it was provided, because that's important for timelines. You want to make sure they can't argue they never received your request. So you've made a request for an evaluation. The next step for schools is they have to do something called a review of existing data. Typically in Arizona, they will hold a meeting for that. They'll want everybody to come together. They'll talk about existing data. So they'll hear from you. If you have an outside evaluation you want to present, you can provide that. They have to consider it. They'll hear from the teachers. If you have outside providers like a behavioral health team, or if the kiddo qualifies for DDD, you could invite those people. Everybody can talk about what we already know, the existing data. And then the team makes a decision. Do we have enough data to decide eligibility right now, or do we need to collect more data? Usually they will say, if they say we have enough data, it's because they're not going to qualify the kid. They're going to say, we have enough data to know they don't qualify. If they're considering qualifying the kiddo, typically what they'll want to do is collect more data. So at the end of the RED meeting, the review of existing data meeting, they'll ask for parental consent to do more testing, school-based testing. Then they have 60 days to do that. At the end of the 60 days, there is another meeting called a MET meeting in Arizona, Multi-Disciplinary Evaluation Team meeting. It's the same group of people coming together. They review all the data that was collected. They determine eligibility. Is the child eligible or not? They look at that two-pronged test. If the child is eligible, then they create an IEP. Sometimes that happens at the same meeting as the MET, but sometimes it's already been a really long meeting, so they're going to schedule yet another meeting, a third meeting, to come back together to create the IEP. And then once it's created, has to be implemented. It's required by law that the team meet at least once a year annually to review and update the IEP. And then at least every 3 years, there needs to be another MET meeting, a reevaluation, to determine if the student continues to qualify. And at those MET meetings or those reevaluation meetings, you can either collect more data, which I typically suggest parents ask for, or you can just agree they still qualify. We don't need any new data at this point to make that determination. I think it's good to get new data every 3 years because kids change as they grow, even if they have a very stagnant disability, like kiddos, let's say, who has Down syndrome, they're never going to not have Down syndrome, but their IQ may change slightly, their cognitive ability and their academic achievement may change, their needs and areas for growth may change. So it's always good to get that free data, because once they leave the system, you'll never really have a chance to get free testing like that again. So I typically suggest, even if we all know kids going to continue to qualify, get the testing done every 3 years so you have updated data. All right, any questions so far on any of that, eligibility or the processes for special ed? Okay, I will keep going. All right, so now I'm going to kind of get into what's in the IEP itself. So the big things to think about are placement, services, accommodations, and modifications. So placement refers to the type of environment in which the student is educated. It's different from location, even though in the real world, those two words are synonymous and kind of mean the same thing. In the special ed world, they mean two different things. So placement really refers to how much time the child is spending in the regular ed setting with typical peers versus segregated in a disability-only classroom or school. Location is about the actual school site or the actual classroom where they go. So placement is an IEP team decision, and it has to be discussed at every IEP meeting. What is their placement? How much time are they spending segregated versus included? Location is not an IEP team decision. And a lot of parents, this is happening a lot, I think, because of staff shortages and COVID and stuff. Schools are closing programs, closing school sites, moving kids around, changing boundary maps. And so that's a location change. So if your kiddo requires, let's say, a self-contained classroom specific to kids with autism, and they've been at school A for the last 3 years in that program, and this year, because of staffing changes, the district is moving that autism self-contained class to school B. They can make that change without an IEP meeting, without your agreement. That's a location change, not a placement change. As long as their placement is still a self-contained autism program that's largely the same as it was, it's really not an IEP team decision. It's just an administrative decision. Now, if I were an attorney for a school district, I would suggest to the school that they do more than send an email to say, hey, next year your kid's going to be at a different school. I would suggest they have a call, maybe a meeting, even if it's not an IEP meeting, to talk you through it. But technically, legally, they could just say, hey, your kid doesn't go to the school anymore. They go over here. All right, in terms of placement, the law does require that to the maximum extent appropriate, students be educated alongside children who are non-disabled. And this concept is called least restrictive environment, or LRE. And that is super important under IDEA. We want to try to keep kids included as much as appropriate. So if it's no longer appropriate because their behaviors are interfering with their ability to learn or their peers' ability to learn, and all possible interventions have been attempted in the regular education setting, we may need to look at moving them to a more restrictive setting, like a separate classroom or a specialized program. But to the greatest extent appropriate, we are trying to keep them included and not segregated. All school districts and charters are are supposed to ensure that they have a continuum of alternative placements available. So something we will hear a lot is a small charter will say, well, we're an all inclusion school. We don't do self-contained. You know, you're either in the regular classroom or you don't go here. And that's illegal. I mean, you know, they can strive for that, and they should. That's least restrictive environment. They should strive for it, but they can't say we just can't help a kid who won't be successful here. They are required to meet every child's needs who enroll. So what they have to do is if they're, you know, a single site school charter and they don't have a separate school site or a separate classroom for kids who need it, they have to contract. They have to either contract with the local school district or a private entity to provide that placement for the child at no cost to the parent. And that's what the law says. So often, and it's not just charters, it is also smaller rural school districts. We will see they actually don't really have a continuum of alternative placements, and they're not great about contracting appropriately. So just be aware that they shouldn't say, we're not a good fit for your kid, you should probably enroll somewhere else. That's not an appropriate response. They have a legal responsibility to meet every child's needs who enrolls with them. So this is what that continuum of alternative placements mostly looks like. You start out at the least restrictive, which would be the general education class. And then you move toward more and more restrictive, separate classes, separate schools, home-based instruction, or hospital or institution. And then in Arizona, these are the service codes you might see on your kiddo's IEP. So we use letter codes. So level A, level B, level C. Level A is the least restrictive. You're spending 80% or more of your day in a regular class. Level B is between 40% and 79% of your day in the regular class. Level C is typically kiddos who are in self-contained classrooms. Level D is a separate school for kids with disabilities. And then I put in some of the other ones. So, you know, when our kiddos do end up in a, you know, juvenile detention or juvenile Department of Corrections facility, they are still entitled to special education there, but their placement changes to FC. Sometimes they will put kids on homebound, which I hate, and I can talk about that if we have time. But when that's the case, their placement code is H. Sometimes they will put I. I've actually really never seen it, but it's for kids who are really severely disabled. They would have an I. Private school placement enrolled by parents. So if you use ESA, for example, or are just paying tuition to put your kiddo at a private school, they don't have an IEP anymore, but the service code in the Arizona Department of Ed system would be level J. All right, so services. So IDEA distinguishes between special education and related services. So special education means specially designed instruction to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. Related services are things like transportation. Well, I think I have examples on the next page. Yeah. So special ed is usually reading, writing, and math. And sometimes behavior support is also considered special education. So that's more like the academic piece of it. Related services are things like speech therapy, interpretation, counseling, physical therapy, nursing. And it does include specialized transportation if the child needs it. And it can include training for parents or teachers as well. And then there's usually another part of the IEP that talks about supplementary aids, assistive technology, and services. And that's often where you'll find things like paraprofessionals or one-on-one aids. Assistive technology could be things like OGCOM devices if you're working with a kiddo who needs that. Or text-to-speech, speech-to-text types of technology will often be listed there as well. All right, then there is a section of the IEP that goes over accommodations and modifications. So IDEA doesn't actually define those two words or distinguish between them, but for whatever reason, practitioners across the country have decided those two words mean two different things, and they're listed differently in most IEPs. So I will explain the difference so that you know when you're in a meeting and people say, no, that's a modification, not an accommodation, why they're making the distinction. So an accommodation typically is something that allows the student to complete the same assignment or test as other students, but with a change in the timing, formatting, setting, scheduling, response, or presentation. So it's not a change to what the child is learning or the level to which they have to perform. It's just changing the method that they perform in or the method they receive the information in. For example, a kiddo who's blind, everybody's reading Romeo and Juliet in their high school class. Every kid who's not visually impaired is reading a regular paperback book. The blind kiddo is reading the same book, but it's in Braille. So that's an easy example of an accommodation. The content is exactly the same. The only difference is the method that the medium through which the child is learning that information because of their impairment. It gets a little more complicated when we're talking about kids with behavioral issues, kids with autism, kids with learning differences. It's not quite as cut and dry as Braille versus print, but accommodations really at the end of the day, the child is achieving the same outcome. They're learning the same academic standard. We're not really changing the content. We're just changing how they access the content. A modification, on the other hand, is a change in content. So we've determined this child cannot learn the same academic content or achieve to the same academic standards as their non-disabled peers. So we are changing what they are learning. And this could mean, everyone else in the high school class is reading Romeo and Juliet at a 9th grade level, but this kiddo has an intellectual disability. They cannot read past a 2nd grade level. So we're giving them a Lexile level 2nd grade version of Romeo and Juliet to read, for example. Or everyone else in math has moved on to long division and fractions. This kiddo is still working on single digit addition, subtraction. So we are not teaching the same content. We are not teaching to the same standard. That's a modification. And schools try to avoid modifications because we want to try to hold kids to the same standards as much as possible, give them every opportunity to learn the same content, only when it's really clear that that's not in the child's best interest, would we look at modifying things for them. All right, so this issue is specific to kids in foster care, the IDEA parent issue. So IDEA does require a parent's written consent for a lot of things. One of them is the evaluation. So when you're first referring a child for an IEP and testing, they do have to get parental consent before they can administer evaluations. Another time it's important to know who the parent is every time you have an IEP meeting, parent is supposed to be invited. When they first determine that a child qualifies for an IEP and they want to start providing services, they need a parent to consent to the initial provision of services. And then finally, if somebody wants to fight the school, they really have to be the parent with legal decision-making rights as to the child. So knowing who the parent is very important, and it's not always clear for our kids in foster care who the parent is for these purposes. So here is what the regulations from IDEA say parent means in the definition section. So parent means first, bio or adoptive parent, second, a foster parent, third, a guardian, fourth is essentially kinship placement, and fifth is a surrogate parent. So that's great, but then the question is, well, what if a child has more than one of these people in their lives? Who is the IDEA parent? Who trumps who? And then the second question is, what if a child has none of these people in their lives? They're in a group home, they don't have anybody, rights are severed. Then what happens? So that's the next slide. So first of all, if you have more than one of those adults who meets the definition of parent, bio or adoptive parent is presumed to be the special education parent unless their rights have been terminated. And that's sometimes a shock for foster parents to hear. I have noticed a provider, I'm taking the kid to school, I enrolled the kid in school, I'm signing field trip permission slips. Of course, I'm the parent for education purposes. Actually, you're not. If bio parents still have rights because there's a dependency, but they haven't yet been severed, they are actually the special ed parent. They are the one who has to be invited to meetings, to consent to testing, to consent to provision of services. And that's true even if they're incarcerated or institutionalized. If they're dead, then no, that helps, make the argument that foster parents should take over because they're dead. If they're missing also, the grayish area is, well, we know where they are, but they're not trying, they're not coming to meetings. The school has invited them and they don't show up. They're not engaging in any services, or we don't know where they are. Those situations make it a little trickier. And the school, if they don't want to test or they don't want to listen to you because you're being a good advocate, will say, well, we're not listening to you because we know bio parents out there somewhere. And so we have to wait to hear from them. So sometimes, the way I work as an attorney is I have to know who the special ed parent is before I can represent a kiddo. So I don't like to leave it in a gray area. If everybody agrees that bio parent is not acting in the child's best interest right now, and foster parent is ready and willing to step in and ask for the testing or, pursue a complaint if needed, I will go to the juvenile court and I will ask, I'll ask either DCS to do it or a GAL or somebody else who's involved, to ask the juvenile court, the dependency judge, to issue an order suspending the rights of bio parent to make special ed decisions and naming either a foster parent or a surrogate parent, somebody else. And that's not the same as asking them to, jump to severance, because there are timelines involved with that, and they are supposed to have a chance to rehabilitate and engage in services and all of that. And they're still able to do that, but it'll be a temporary order suspending bio parents' rights to make these decisions and naming somebody else until the case is completed. And then when I have that order from a court in my hand, it's much easier to go to a school and say, you have to respect foster parent in this way. Now, if you are a foster parent and bio parents are trying, and especially if the case plan is reunification and we're working toward that, you can always work with the bio parent, bring them in, tell them some of the stuff I'm telling you, help them write a letter asking for an evaluation, try to get them involved in this process. And then they can, they retain their rights, they can be the ones to fight, but they may need a little help along the way. Okay. So essentially, when can foster parents be the IDEA parent? I kind of talked through this. If we don't know if the identity or whereabouts of the bio parents are unknown, if the rights have been terminated. The third one is the gray area, right? They're failing to actively participate. The school may be willing to treat foster parent as the IDEA parent, but often they're not, because they're not trying to name someone who's going to fight with them. So they'd rather have an unnamed opponent than give you the ability to fight with them on it. But then the fourth one is kind of what I said. So if DCS or the GAL, if we can get the team on the same page that it's not in the best interest of the kiddo for bio parents to be making these decisions, we can petition the court to suspend their rights and name somebody else. Okay, but were there any questions on that? Sorry.
Yeah, I have a question about, in your experience, why is that the school, in general, they resist the process of having kids access to those programs? Just like they always tend to make things difficult, going through tests, going through everything, all this kind of stuff. Why is that? Do they have any I don't know, incentive of not helping the process?
Did you hear all of that, Amanda? So why is the school really resisting to help parents through the process? We get that a lot too.
So I like to think that everyone who goes into education, teachers and administrators, do it because they love kids and they want to help kids. But in this country, education is extremely underfunded. And IDEA, the special ed law, it's a federal law, all schools have to follow it, but it's not a fully funded mandate. The federal government sends us some money to do this, but it's not fully funded. So states are having to pull from other parts of their budget to provide these services. So it's not a great answer. I wish the answer was, of course, schools should do everything they can to help kids, but they're having to balance a budget. So it's money is the answer, I think, in general. They are going to do what they have to do to avoid getting sued, which costs even more money, but they are not going to go above and beyond and provide more than they're minimally required to do. And so they do resist. And so they will look for these types of loopholes, like around the foster parent thing, to say, well, how can we push this off? How can we delay? And especially for kids in foster care, who again are the most vulnerable, who should be identified right away before they disrupt. Schools kind of think, well, if we just push this off a couple months, kiddo will probably disrupt anyway, and then they're not our problem. And so there is, I think that is the mentality for a lot of administrators. I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. I only hear the bad things as a lawyer who represents kids. I'm sure there are a lot of really good schools, teachers, and administrators out there who do everything they can in the really tough spot they're in financially to serve kids. But I hear what you're saying. Often we will see schools that are very, very resistant to qualifying kids or to giving them a lot of services. And I think the answer is money. Yeah, which is a bummer, but that's kind of the state of things. All right, so what about kids in group homes? So sometimes we have kiddos, and I know you all are part of a foster group, but this is just good to know if you get a kid who was in a group home or a kiddo who was with you ends up in a group home. When kids are in group homes, if their parents, bio or adoptive parents' rights have been fully severed by the court, they don't have kinship, they don't have a guardian, there's really nobody who can qualify to serve as their special ed parent. In that case, the state of Arizona has to appoint them a surrogate parent within 30 days. So surrogate parents, they can be volunteers, they can be CASA advocates, although they can't, if you're a CASA for a kid, you can't also be their surrogate parent. You'd have to be a surrogate for one kid and a CASA for a different kid. It could be a family member, or it could be a former foster parent as well. But the surrogate parent cannot be someone who is an employee of the school that the child attends or a DCS employee. So DCS cannot serve as the child's surrogate parent. Nobody from the school can serve as the surrogate parent, and nobody from the group home can serve as the surrogate parent, because the group home is technically a contractor of the child welfare agency. So it's got to be a volunteer who's gone through some training, and they get appointed. It's similar to a CASA, they're appointed, except they're not going to dependency court hearings, they're going to IEP meetings primarily. So their only role is to serve as the IDEA or special education parent. All right, so dispute resolution. So you mentioned there's often a lot of resistance, or it feels a little adversarial when you're asking for services from the school. So there are dispute resolution options. And I want to go through some of them. I'm already way past time, but let's go through some of these quickly. So options that exist: independent educational evaluations, mediation, state complaints, OCR complaints, and due process. So independent educational evaluations: if the school district evaluates your child and you disagree with the results of the evaluation or the decisions that are made based on that evaluation, you have the right to request an independent educational evaluation at public expense. This is essentially a second opinion. You're asking for a private evaluator of your choosing to do a new evaluation. You are entitled to one of these per school evaluation. So you can't, it's not an unlimited right. You only get one each time the school evaluates. And you have to ask for it within 2 years of the school having done their evaluation. You can't wait longer than that. When you make this request, the school either has to pay for the independent educational evaluation in a reasonable time frame, or they can file a due process complaint against you as the parent to argue before a hearing officer that the evaluation they did was perfectly adequate and they should not have to pay for an independent educational evaluation. Your evaluator will have to meet agency criteria, meaning if they required that anybody who does a cognitive IQ test be a licensed school psychologist, you would have to find a private licensed school psychologist. You can't just use, any person you find on the street. They have to meet the same criteria. Unfortunately, even after you go out and get this second opinion and bring it to the school still doesn't have to agree with it or follow it or adopt it, but they do have to consider it. They have to have a meeting where they look at it and talk it through. And it is helpful to get these done because it shows the school that you understand your rights, that you have somebody who's an expert in the field who's on your side, you have evidence to support your position. And if you have to go to a hearing or mediation, you would have a potential expert witness, an expert report you could refer to. So those are all the benefits of an IEE. Now, sorry, let me go back really quick. The only person who can request an IEE successfully is the special education parent. So you would have to figure that out. Are you the special ed parent? If you're not, can you work with the special ed parent to make this request? Because the school can ignore the request if it's not from the right person. All right, the next one is mediation. So this is a free service provided by the Arizona Department of Education. If you're in a dispute with the school and you want an opportunity to try to mediate or negotiate with them, you can request mediation. There's a link in the slide to the page where you can make the request. You have somebody neutral who's been trained by the Department of Ed who facilitates the communication, but they're not a judge. They won't decide who's right or wrong. They just try to help you reach a compromise. If you do reach a compromise, it will be memorialized in a written agreement, which is binding. The whole mediation process is voluntary. So if you feel like it's not going anywhere, you can always get up and walk away, as can the school if they want to. And yeah, this can be a really helpful way to try to resolve a dispute without having to actually file a complaint or go to a hearing. All right, next, a state complaint. This is one that anybody can file, whether you are the IDEA parent or not. If you know that a school is not following IDEA, for example, they're not following a student's IEP as written, you could file this type of complaint, and you're alerting the Department of Ed that the school is out of compliance, and then the Department of Ed is required by law to investigate that and make a finding. And if they find that the school is not following the law, they do have to order some type of corrective action. Now, these types of complaints are really only good for very clear black and white violations of the law. So kiddo's IEP says he's supposed to be getting, 30 minutes of speech therapy a week. The speech therapist has been out on maternity leave all year and kiddo has not gotten any speech therapy. Anybody could file a state complaint about that. The department would look into it. If they, that's substantiated, they will order some type of corrective action. Probably for this, in that situation, they would order what's called compensatory education or make-up services to make that child whole for what they missed out on. But if your dispute with the school is like, I think my kiddo should qualify for an IEP, and the school says they don't qualify, the Department of Ed is not going to, referee that. That's something that requires more subjective decision-making by a judge. It will require a lot of evidence and testimony. So for that, you would have to go to a due process hearing, which I'll talk about in a second. But for really clear-cut violations, like not following an IEP, not following timelines, failing to hold a meeting when they're supposed to have held a meeting, not issuing a prior written notice, those types of things, a state complaint is great because they'll just be found out of compliance and ordered to fix it. You only have a year from the time of the non-compliance to file, and it's really easy to file. There's an online complaint system with fillable forms that you can fill out yourself. Office for Civil Rights complaints are good for issues with discrimination. So the Office for Civil Rights, remember I talked about Section 504 at the beginning and how even if you have an IEP, you're covered by 504. That's important because kids with IEPs or 504 plans can file this complaint with the US Department of Ed if you feel your child's been discriminated against based on disability. It's also good if your child is experiencing excessive restraint or seclusion at school. OCR does a good job of investigating those types of complaints as well. So this would be a place to go for that. It's a much shorter timeline. You have to file within 6 months. They also have their own mediation program. So if you file a complaint and you want to try to mediate and come to a private agreement between you and the school, you can use their facilitated resolution between parties program. Again, you can file the complaint online, very easy. This is one, I think anybody can file it. You don't have to be the special ed parent, but you would have to have the legal guardian, which I think would be DCS. You may also need the IDEA parent to sign off. Well, I guess you don't need the IDEA parent because it's not an IDEA complaint. So I think probably you would just need DCS to sign off on the complaint, but you don't have to be the special ed parent yourself to file it. And then the big one under IDEA is a due process complaint. So this is when you have that substantive disagreement about eligibility or provision of services. You know, you think kiddo needs this type of service and the school won't provide it, or you think kiddo needs to be in this type of program and the school won't put them there. For those big substantive disputes, you need to go before a judge and you need to present evidence to convince the judge that you're right and the school is wrong. So you request a due process hearing through the Arizona Department of Ed, but they refer that request over to another department called the Office of Administrative Hearings. You get assigned an administrative law judge, and then it's similar to going to court. You're not actually going to court because there's this administrative process, but you are essentially preparing an evidentiary hearing. So you have your evidence, IEPs, evaluations, outside evaluations, video footage, interviews, whatever you've done and gathered that supports your position. You have witnesses, so you may want to bring your independent educational evaluator if you've got an IEE. You may want to bring the DDD support specialist or a behavior coach or anybody you can think of who supports your position. The school's going to do the same thing, and the school will have legal representation. They always do. So it's tough to go to these hearings. It's a lot for a parent to navigate on their own. It's expensive to get an attorney to represent you. We do representation free of charge, but we almost never go to due process because we just don't have enough attorneys or staff. We try to resolve everything in an informal setting because it is a lot of work to prep all of this for a hearing. But this is sort of your right as a parent. Again, this is only for the special ed parent. You would have to make sure you are the IDEA or special education parent before you could file this complaint. You have 2 years to file it. And then if you lose, you can appeal to state or federal court. And you have to do that within 35 days of losing. So I'm out of time, but I did have more slides about school discipline that hopefully, will be helpful. I think they're included in your booklet, so you can look at that, some of the rights that kids have when it comes to discipline. I think I had some stuff at the end about, ESA. There's a little bit of information about that because I know some parents had questions about the Empowerment Scholarship account system. So there's information there. More. And then my information is here at the end. So if you are having issues or you have more questions, we're working on revamping our website. It's not that great right now. I'm hoping it gets more user-friendly, but we do have a lot of resources on our website. And you can call us to do an intake if you're interested in additional legal services. Like I said, we don't have unlimited staff or resources, so we are selective in the cases that we take, but you can call and complete an intake with our office, and at the very least you'll get referred to some additional resources and be provided some tailored technical assistance, but you may be assigned an advocate or an attorney to represent you depending on the facts of the case. So that's our contact information. And I don't want to cut any more into the next presenter's time, but if anybody has questions, I will stay on through her presentation, and if she's willing to stay on for a minute, I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thanks, Amanda. We appreciate it so much, and thanks for creating this booklet for today too. This is really great. Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Thank you guys.
Okay, so while we get Netta set up, is there any questions that you have for Amanda she can help address?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
You also work with Arizona tribal children?
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, I referred to DCS throughout, but I really meant child welfare agency. So including kids who are in tribal social services. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, you can do it from your computer now.
autism.
You
No,
have,
no, currently I'm not, it was gone just,
but you're,
that I'm working, outside here, working with someone who have, so
Yeah.
I'm interested in the subject in general to be, you know, basically, additional information is really.
are you licensed for children though?
Yes,
And it's for foster children?
exactly.
Okay, so he's licensed for foster children. And you're licensed for adult.
Yeah, I have now. I used to be both. but-
And how many do you have in your home?
I have Christian in our.
So you have two, and thank you. And then Cheyenne,
Adults.
and how many do you have?
I have, well, two at the moment.
Two
and
adults.
Actually, one is autistic.
Okay.
And has Down syndrome.
Thank you. And then Dora, what do you have in your home? Adults, and how many do you have?
One.
One adult in your home. Okay, great. And Michelle works at our agency here, and she actually helps find respite for the families when they need, you know, respite, whether it's adult developmental child or foster home. And they all have to be licensed to cover that respite, so. And then you met me, Christine. So anyway, I just wanted you to kind of know
Mhm.
what our, and then Sam Dyer is our executive director, in case you've not met him yet. So,
Hi, Sam.
Thank you. Yeah, it helps me to know
yes,
a lot. So this is autism training for a place to call home. My name is Neda Nazarbadi. We already did a good job of introducing me, so I'm not going to go into details for that. I do have a lot of slides, so I'm going to go in very quickly, but I do want to leave a lot of time, well, some time for questions, because I think it's very important to be individualized. I don't know why it's not working. Is it supposed to move in mine? Okay. here. I have to
There you
click
go,
a
okay.
certain-
Do you want me to click for you?
Here, you
So
might be
the
able to-
purpose, I got it.
Okay.
The purpose of this presentation is to talk about autism spectrum disorder. Now it's called ASD. So you'll hear that acronym a lot. And the behaviors of symptoms of autism and what is applied behavior analysis. It's a form of treatment of autism. So we'll go over that. And I always like to end with mindfulness, which is part of self-care for yourselves and people on the spectrum as well. So that's my presentation. So what is autism? Let me just move my, there you go. Autism spectrum disorder is a developmental disability that can cause significant social communication and behavior challenges. So it's a social diagnosis. It's also known as ASD, autism, Asperger's syndrome. They don't really do Asperger's syndrome anymore. It used to be Asperger's for high functioning kiddos that were highly intelligent and gifted. But with Asperger's syndrome, the doctors, they don't, or the insurances, they don't cover anymore. So they just got rid of the diagnosis if there's not going to be any coverage. So they just stick with autism spectrum disorder spectrum. The spectrum covers the whole ASD diagnosis, autism spectrum conditions or pervasive developmental disorder. So the challenges with individuals with autism, according to the Diagnosis and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder, DSM-5, it's a guide created by American Psychiatric Association used in diagnosis of mental disorders. People with ASD, they have difficulties with communication and interactions with other people. They're restrictive interests and repetitive behaviors. And they also have symptoms that affect a person's ability to function in schoolwork and other areas of life. So in Arizona, 1 in 63, so 1.6% of 8-year-old children have autism. That's 68% of children identified with autism have documented ASD. And then that's 4 times more in boys rather than girls. These are just all statistics. I'll go through my slide a little bit quicker because I have about 40 or 50. What causes autism? So there are some genetic factors, there are some environmental factors, might be some brain abnormalities. The genetic factors ranges from, there's no really like one certain mutation or gene mutation that actually cause autism. studies revealed that basically they took a whole bunch of kids with autism or a whole bunch of individuals with autism, and they figured there's not one gene mutation. So that's something to note. There are environmental factors, there's some toxin levels, just, foods these days is not as organic as what we had 100 years ago. So that, those things also develop, or at least have some sort of correlation with the genetic factors. And then there are some brain abnormalities. The larger size of the brain, or some of the brain size is slightly larger. So, but again, none of those things you can really predict because it's a social behavior diagnosis. So I'll go into how you can actually get the diagnosis. There's no medical test. So you can't really go to a doctor in 1-year-old or 6 months and be like, does this kid have autism? So that's something the science is still working on. ASD can sometimes be detected at 18 months of age or younger, but normally it's after 2. Normally it's, before 2, I've seen a lot of both personal and in my profession that they just don't diagnose kids. And, especially because they want to wait and see. So that wait and see approach has to do a lot with that factor. Some people are not diagnosed until they're adolescents and adults. So that's something that it's a fact. And this delay means that people with ASD might not get the early help that they need. So most of the time, the school or parents or, a caretakers, they really don't know what's going on. And they just see the child as having sensory needs, or, maybe the child is overstimulated, but they really don't know what's causing it or what's behind it. So what we can do as a developmental monitoring, we as caretakers, we can look for developmental milestones from birth until 5 years. We can really monitor, whereas the screening process goes to healthcare professionals that they help with really having those tests. For example, one of the tests, it's called ADOS test, and it's specific for diagnosis of autism, and it goes stages by stages. So you can take your child to the developmental pediatrician by the referral of your pediatrician, of your doctors, and go and do this test. And based on the test, it would tell you what the level of autism is. Having said that, all of those tests, because they're all behavioral, make sure that you really, they're not all accurate 100%. So just keep that in mind. You can get a false diagnosis or else false non-diagnosis as well. Some early signs of ASD is a social communication and interaction skills, avoid or does not keep eye contact, does not respond to name by 9 months of age, or does not have facial expressions like happy, sad. These are all, does not play simple interactive games like peekaboo and pat a cake, or uses few or no gestures by 12 months. So pointing is a huge one. They don't point at a developmental milestones that they should. Does not share interest with others by 15 months. So they don't really come to you and show you their toys, and does not point or show you something interesting. For example, like if you're in a car ride, they don't really point to whatever objects like, oh, here's a car, ambulance, police truck. They don't do that as much. Does not notice when others are hurt or upset by 24 months. Does not notice other children or join them in play by 36 months. Does not pretend to be something else like a teacher, superhero, just in general pretend play by 48 months. Or does not sing, dance, act by 60 months of age. Now, these are based on the CDC guidelines, based on the DSM-5 criteria. Again, sometimes parents see these and be like, oh, you know what? He has a great eye contact. He or she has, they actually come to us when they get upset. They show affection, so they don't have autism. So they don't need to have all these signs. Even if they have a few, they might still be in a spectrum. So it's good to get that help. And as a parent, sometimes parents, they want to avoid getting that diagnosis because it's so scary. I can talk about this because I'm a parent of a child on a spectrum. it's so scary to get that. And so sometimes it's hard to go through all of that, and you dismiss some of the signs. But even if there is 1 or 2 signs in it, make sure you check with your developmental pediatrician. The next one is restricted or repetitive behaviors of interest. That's a big one as well. They line up toys or other objects that they get upset when the order is changed, something is missing, some sort of OCD behaviors as well, repeat words or phrases over and over again. It's called echolalia. They play with toys in some ways every single time. So they don't try to be creative or imaginative, but they repeat the same thing over and over again. They focus on parts of the objects rather than the whole object, or how to play with a car toy functionally. So they, for example, they look at the toy wheels and they might just do stuff like that. They get upset if there's a minor change in the schedule, transitions, whatever. They have obsessive interest with certain things. They must follow certain routines. They, in some cases, they have sensory needs. They flap hands, rock body, spin self in a circle, and stuff like that. They have unusual reactions to the way things sound, smell, taste, look, or feel as well. And so some other characteristics, they have delayed language skills, delayed movement skills, delayed cognitive and learning skills. They're hyperactive or impulsive or inattentive behaviors. They might have seizures or epilepsy disorder. They have unusual sleeping habits. They have GI issues. They have unusual mood or emotional reactions. They might have anxiety, stress, excessive worry, and lack of fear, or more fear than expected. So I know it's a lot, but again, they don't need to have all of it. They just the problem with ASD is we've seen it all, and there's just no kid is the same as the other child on the spectrum. So they're all very unique in their own characteristics as well. There are some type of treatments that would be helpful in this sense. There are behavioral treatment, developmental, educational, social, relational, pharmacological, and psychological, and there are some other alternative treatments as well. So applied behavior analysis. Applied behavior analysis, also known as ABA because it's a mouthful, it encourages desired behavior and discourages undesired behavior to improve a variety of skills. Progress is tracked and measured, and so ABA is a therapy based on the science of learning and behavior. So the design, implementation, and evaluation of the environmental modification to produce socially significant improvements in human behaviors. Now, these are the definitions. I will go over what that means because it's really easy. Behavior analysis helps us to understand how behavior works, how behavior is affected by the environment, how learning takes place, increase language and communication skills, improve attention, focus, social skills, memory, academics, and decrease problem behavior. So that's basically what the other slide meant. It's in a general sense. How does ABA therapy works? Applied behavior analysis involves many techniques for understanding and changing behaviors, such as adapted to meet the needs of each unique person. And so we do have to have those unique individuals' needs met. ABA services can be provided by many different locations, such as home, school, community, and it teaches skills that are useful in everyday life. It can involve one-on-one teaching or the group instructions. So what is behavior? Behavior is communication, any kind of behavior. For children who have limited communication skills, challenging behavior serves to communicate needs or wants. For example, I hit my head, I receive attention. I bite my friend, I receive adult attention, or escape from non-preferred activities, such as, let's say, my teacher is giving me a task, I start doing something we just call it maladaptive behavior, and the teacher comes and gives me a timeout. Is that timeout really effective? Because, hey, I just got to escape from whatever task I was given. So that's why we do behavior therapy. We really analyze the details of the behavior, and I'm getting myself ahead. I promise not to do that because I tend to stick in one slide and just talk about ABA, but I'll go into details in further slides. So basis of interventions. Before we select consequences, it is critical that we must know why the behavior is occurring, because we need to have the right kind of consequence. How do we, and this is not just for kids with autism, just to let you know, it's for with kids, with adults, it's with individuals. So ABA is not designed for kids on the spectrum. It's really a science of human behavior. How do we find the why and the function? We call the function why function is the same thing. Why is this important? This is important because our reaction may actually reward problem behavior, even if we think we're punishing. Same as the example I just gave you. In ABA, behavior interventions is determined based upon the function of the behavior. Interventions are not based upon diagnosis. Diagnosis has no impact on which interventions will be effective. Rather, one must know the function of the behavior to determine an effective intervention. So in the example I just gave you, the teacher gives a task, or you give a task to your child, and the child doesn't want to do the task. They do some sort of screaming or punching or hitting or some sort of maladaptive behavior. And what is the first thing you do by nature? You'll probably just say like, go to your room, or, that's a natural thing we do as parents and caregivers. But the child goes like, yes, I got to escape, goes to their room, they play. That is most likely will increase the behavior next time, because next time you give a task again, they would do the same thing because they get to escape. So that's how we really analyze the behavior, and how it's important to really know the function of the behavior so we can give the right consequences. Functions of behavior. Why is the behavior occurring? In order to eliminate or reduce a maladaptive behavior, we need to know the cause of problem behavior and its function. Look at the ABC of behavior. This is super important. A, antecedent. What triggered the behavior? B is the behavior, is your target behavior with the right definitions, and it needs to be observable, measurable, all those good stuff. How did the child act is the B, and consequence, what happened right after the behavior. Make sure you really notice that I said right after the behavior is normally they say between 0 to 3 seconds. If you reward or punish the behavior a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes after that, you might accidentally reinforce whatever happened right before that behavior. So for example, like I normally get very excited when I work with kids and they do something for me, and if it's super new or whatever, I sometimes scream. I'm like, wow, great job. And then they just kind of go like that. It's not a good example, but then I reward them. That scream, I always try to be mindful of my own senses and don't get too excited when I work with kids, because that scream might be actually punishing for the kids. And so what happened right after the behavior is a consequence. It should be the correct consequence as well. So ABC of the behavior, what happens before, antecedent, behavior, observable, measurable, agreeable. Everyone can see that targeted behavior, and we all agree that that's the behavior we're looking for, or we're looking to change. And then what happens after the behavior is the consequence events. Antecedent, what the behavior occurs, when the behavior occurs, what is the child doing? Who is present? What kind of activities the child engage in? So these are all the triggers. Was the child asked to do something or go somewhere? Is there a preferred item present? Does the child appear to engage in behavior because they're upset or excited? All those things are the ones that we actually want to pay attention to for antecedents. Basically what triggers the behavior. And then the consequence is also very important, because in addition to antecedent, we must look at what comes after the behavior as a consequence. Remember, your reaction is not the only type of consequence. Any change in the environment. So you might have a perfect reaction, ignoring the behavior or following through or whatever, but there might be a brother and sister who's giggling and laughing at a maladaptive behavior, and that might reinforce the behavior. So you, for example, like you're giving a task to your child, and your child is pushing the task away or doing whatever, and you're trying to follow through, but then the brother and sister or the environment is giving attention to the task. So most likely that will still occur because of the attention that they're receiving from other peers as well. So do you or anyone else say anything to your child about the behavior? Do you give attention? Do you tell them, get it to stop? Do you assume that the child is too upset or escalated to continue? All those things are the kind of consequences that you have to remember. So there are 4 functions of behavior. Gain access to attention, and this is again, not just with a child, with adult or any kind of behaviors that we do. We, you know, Sandra, the example I gave here, Sandra pulls her hair every time her mom begins speaking with someone else in the room. You notice, like every time we're on the phone, our kids, if they're little, or even, you know, even husbands and wives might just come around and kind of wanting to get your attention. Attainment of tangible. So the second one is desire for an activity or an object. Chris pushes kids over at the park when he wants one of the toys. That's very, you know, it happens all the time. Escape from a demand or conditions. That usually happens at schools as well, because there are a lot of demands at school. And the fourth one is sensory or automatic reinforcement. So self-stimulatory behavior. So there's your child has some sensory needs that it needs to be met. So there are examples. Let me see what time.
11:30.
Okay. I'll just do some quick examples. So escape is child is asked to clean room. Tantrum happens. See the behavior, parents list the child play instead of playing. Okay, fine, you can play, but you have to clean your room tomorrow. Well, you just reinforce the tantrum behavior. B, another example. A child does not want siblings to play with a toy. Child hits siblings and siblings gives toy back to the child. Attention. Parents is taking with another, talking to another adult, child begins to ask some questions over and over again. Parent stops the talking with an adult and attend to the child. That's an example of attention. Most likely that behavior will occur again because of the consequence that the child received. Internal stimulation. Child is alone or around parents, sibling, or classmates, but then they hand flaps, toe walks, or sucks their thumb, spins, line up objects, and then adult would ignore the behavior. Those self-stimulatory behaviors, they're not really because of attention or tangible or escape. They're just something, for example, if you get a mosquito bite, you start scratching, that's sensory.
Is it almost a self-soothing behavior, an internal stimulation?
Yeah, any kind of sensory needs that the child has, or we all have. I mean, some people, they just rock back and forth, and some people like need to, you know, do this in order to be able to communicate properly. So, you know, we all have sensory needs. So forming a plan, anytime we select a behavior to decrease, there are two main steps. Make the behavior ineffective and teach an appropriate alternative. Making the behavior ineffective this is where our work is determined, the function that pays off, and based on the determined function, we simply need to remove the reinforcement for the behavior extension. I'll give you a simple example. The child, or you know, somebody comes to you, or child comes to you, back to the same example, with a phone, and they say, mom, and then or you know, daddy, and then you just stop your phone call and you just say, what do you want? So instead of saying, what do you want? You made that maladaptive behavior effective. You can say, you can still stop the phone call and say, what do you ask? Or how do you ask nicely? And then teach them that they have to tap you on the shoulder and be like, excuse me, can I talk to you for a second? And then once they said that, then reward them with answering their questions. So you just do that replacement behavior right before you actually acknowledge what they're talking about, so that their maladaptive behavior is not really enforced, but tapping behavior is enforced and rewarded. So that's one of the strategies with how to do a replacement behavior. For example, another example could be like, you're asking somebody to do something, and if they, you know, start screaming and they don't want to do it and this and that, just say, you know what, if you don't want to do it, you don't need to scream at me. All you need to do is, or say is, can I do it later? And then teach them how to say it. Once they say it, can I do it later? Then you say, sure, you know, maybe you can do it in 1 hour, set a timer, and then go. So you're still reinforcing the behavior, but you're reinforcing a good replacement behavior rather than a maladaptive behavior. Oftentimes, that's a really, really good strategy because it makes the screaming ineffective and it makes the replacement behavior that's appropriate effective. So why not? I mean, it's if we have to do the same amount of effort to want something, it doesn't matter if I can scream, and if it's ineffective, then I can ask, and if it's effective, then I will ask and get what I want. You have to reinforce it though. You can't say if they scream and then you start you know, kind of stopping and giving, okay, fine, you can have this toy or you can have a break or whatever. But if they say, Mom, can I do it later? And then you say, no, you have to do it now. And then they scream and then you let them do it. So does that make sense? You have to be able to reinforce the replacement behavior and not reinforce the inappropriate behavior. So you have to think about that order as well. So 3 ways to modify behaviors, another strategy of ABA: preventative strategy, reactive strategy, and replacement strategy. Preventative is doing something before the behavior occurs. You always know whenever you're going to the park or whatever, your child starts asking for their favorite toy in a very non-compliance, inappropriate manner. You have their favorite toys ready and you just teach them how to ask for it appropriately. So those are some of the preventative strategies. There are reactive strategies based on the consequences. So ABC is very important. Based on the consequences, you have the appropriate reactive strategies. And then there are replacement strategies that we just talked about to replace problem behaviors with appropriate behaviors. Preventative strategies, behavior momentum is one of them. You basically ask people to say a lot of yes. So you place several easy demands. I mean, enforce heavily, I'm following through. Good job, thank you for doing this, thank you for doing that. And then you place your difficult demands in between them. So and then you reinforce their behaviors. Choices, giving them choices is always a really, really good strategy for both adults and kids. I mean, we all like to have choices. Arranging or rearranging the environment to make sure that the child has some predictability and or the adult have some schedule, they know what's coming next. Inform the person of your expectations. Setting up clear rules and expectations is huge. And create motivations. A lot of the times, even as adults, we don't have motivations to do stuff. So creating motivations even for our own self is super important and huge in order to prevent the problem behavior. Social stories and role play, we can talk about those before the behavior happens. Using first you can clean your room, then you can have a cookie. And reactive strategies, some of them are if they're based on escape-based behaviors, you just have to follow through with your demand. If there are attention, you have to not give attention to inappropriate behavior and simply replace it to give attention to appropriate behavior. I used to be a teacher, and once I learned about ABA, all I needed to do, instead of saying, I just changed my method instead of saying, Johnny, please be quiet, all I needed to do was saying, Alice, thank you for being quiet. And that helped a lot because all individual special kids, they want to be known, they want to be seen, they want to get attention from their teachers. All you need to do is give positive attention to the kids who are doing well, and the rest of the kids will join that group. Oh, so okay, I'll try to simplify it. Reactive strategies continued. So if they want a tangible item and you want to ignore the inappropriate behavior, if they're asking for iPad and they're screaming to get an iPad, you just really teach them how to get the iPad from, instead of screaming, you just get it with a replacement behavior that's appropriate. And then I'm going to skip those because that would take 10 minutes for me to explain, but you'll get access to these presentations. And then you have my contact number, so you can call me and ask me. And it's in all simplicity, how would we make a behavior ineffective? So for example, if the behavior occurs for attention, you can do planned ignoring. And these are just some strategies, just keep that in mind. They're not prescription, but every individual is different and every behavior is different. If behavior occurs to escape, you can follow through with your demands and make sure that you're, they don't escape the behavior by maladaptive behavior, or you can teach a replacement behavior. They can ask for a break in an appropriate manner. If the behavior occurs to access items or activity, you can deny access until they ask appropriately. And if it's automatic or sensory, for example, like if I have a mosquito bite and if I'm scratching it to the point that it's bleeding, you can put a Band-Aid on it, or that's called response blocking. And so replacement behavior, that's something that we talked about a little bit, so I will skip this one. To reinforcer delivery, this is huge with our field. Basically 95% of what we do is based on the reinforcer. Knowing the right reinforcer is the first one. You have to know, because if I'm for example, like having reinforcement for all my kids of some sort of like positive reward with stickers, maybe not all of them like stickers, maybe not all of them likes hugs, maybe not everybody likes even social praise, maybe somebody likes water, somebody hates water. So you have to, the very first step is recognizing the reinforcer, not based on what you think is a reinforcer for the child, but we do something that is called preference assessment and reinforcer assessment, and we really assess the child's reinforcer to really know if it's reinforcing enough for them to do the work. That's another thing, because sometimes parents think, oh, he really likes water, bubble bath, whatever, but is it really enough for them to actually do their homework in order to access that? Maybe not. So we really have to assess that. And motivation, obviously. So bottom line is, if you reinforce the behaviors you want your child to display or ignore, or quickly and naturally redirect the behavior you don't want your child to display, you will get more appropriate behaviors and less inappropriate behaviors. That's supported by research. And so there are 4 basic steps for caregivers, and then there's 6 basic steps for more professional setting. Time
20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay, let me see how many slides I have. I'll go over it quickly, and then you'll have access to the presentations if I don't get to finish it. So the 4 basic steps is the functional behavior and developing realistic goals in objectively defined terms, teaching management skills based on the function of the behavior, and regularly monitoring and evaluating the progress. The 6 steps that are part of the functional behavior assessment is identifying the target behavior, gathering data, antecedent behavior consequences, identifying pattern and hypothesis, and to determine the purpose. Is it attention, tangible, escape, avoidance, or if it's sensory? Testing the hypothesis and increasing the likelihood of the pattern is correct or predictable. Behavior support plan, developing strategies, and then 6 is identifying patterns or hypothesis. Make changes if necessary, and always be flexible. Positive reinforcement is something that we do all the time, is one of the main strategies in ABA. When the behavior is followed by something that is valued, or like a reward, a person is more likely to repeat that behavior. Planning and ongoing assessment. So we have a qualified and trained VCBA that comes to your house or place, and they develop all these plans about communication, language, social skills, self-care, play and leisure, motor skills, academic, and all of that. So what is evidence that supports ABA? We have tons of research based on so many different individuals that went through ABA, and their behaviors have increased. Their learned skills, their maladaptive behavior decreased. So ABA is the evidence-based strategy. And where do you find ABA service? Autism Society. They have a list of providers, whether your needs are for adults, for children, for school-based, for home-based. There are lots of different schools out there. There are lots of different clinics and home-based therapies, and they're all great. And they're all listed under Autism Society as well. Self-care and well-being. This, I really want to get to that point, because it's important for both our professions and caregivers to individualize whether they have autism or any kind of special needs, or really any needs. I mean, if you're human, I think you should do self-care and well-being. I'm not a good example, but I always preach it.
I know.
I preach it so that one day I actually listen to myself, but I think self-care is important to avoid burnouts, and mindfulness has been found to be positively affect of well-being. A survey of mental health professionals revealed that mindfulness is a significant mediator between self-care and well-being. So what is mindfulness anyway? Overview of the terms. So behavior is the activity of living organism, and these are all based on my studies, so it's a little bit scientific. Overt behavior is based on behaviors that's outside of the skin. We can see it, observe it, measure it. Covert behavior is private events, behavior inside the skin, inner thoughts, feelings, urges. And so those covert behaviors, mind is part of it, and a cognitive safe place like I would be part of it as well. Mindfulness is focusing one's attention on the present moment of the non-judgmental or accepting way that is zoning into a stimulus or stimulus feature. For example, if you're taking a shower, you're really listening to the water. You're really zoning into washing your body. You're not thinking about 10 things you need to do that day, but you're really focusing on every single thing that you're doing at the present moment. And meditation is basically mindlessness, giving the thinking a rest, zoning out, and really being thoughtless. And so those are really important, because I used to think back in the day that I can, shower is the time that I actually have, I can plan my day or whatever. But if you're really being in the present moment, right after shower, an idea or something comes to your mind that is beyond something that you planned. I probably shouldn't say this, but it's probably your higher self or your inner guidance. I shouldn't say this because I'm giving scientific, not that that's not scientific. Okay, I'm gonna stop. Mindfulness overview. Mindfulness is intentionally focusing on one's attention on the experience occurring in the present moment in a non-judgmental, accepting way. Even if it's a sad experience, just accepting it with a stance of compassion, interest, friendliness, and open-heartedness towards experience observed in a present moment, regardless of how pleasant or aversive it may be. And it is a behavior of fully attending to the present. When you're being mindful, you notice your thoughts as an outside observer would identify you are having just a thought with an objective observation. So incorporating mindfulness techniques into daily life has been shown to increase attention and awareness. That's huge, because with this technology, with iPads and TV and everything these days, like I feel like a lot more people are just coming to me and just saying like, I can't really pay attention. So my answer is always like yoga, meditation, really go back to those basic things that we used to do as human beings. We used to just relax more, and now with everyday go lifestyle, we have a lot more people with attention disorders. So that's something that would help. Improving the ability to focus on a current setting, instead of thinking about other things, reduce negativity, depression, and suffering. So I'm not going to read those. There are some apps, there are some podcasts, there are some books that I gathered, and these are, again, you can have access to these later in the presentation. Affirmations are short, powerful statements that allows you to be in control of your thoughts. Research has proven that around 80% of 5,000 subconscious thoughts you have in a day are negative ones. Voila, which is awful, but with positive affirmations, we can reverse those. When you consciously think positive thoughts, it becomes much easier to control negative ones that they try to take over. And so this is something I do with my own kids. We go through positive affirmations, we record them and we play them in the mornings and right before bedtime. So I'll just show you a little bit of it, just so that's something you can do with yourself, with people. I don't know.